Good evening, I'm Jim Zirin, and this is The Digital Age. Tonight's show is about the virtual museum. Museums have traditionally been thought of as buildings housing great works of art. Bricks and mortar. But recently, thanks to the Google Art Project, it is possible for a museum goer to take a virtual stroll through 17 great museums without ever leaving his or her computer. So our question tonight is, will museums largely become virtual? And here to discuss this issue with us is the director of the Museum of Modern Art. He is Glenn Lowry. Glenn, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, you have said that museums are fundamentally changing institutions, unstable. This is really a sea change from anything that museums have ever been, isn't it?
Well, I think the digital revolution has been a very beneficial revolution for museums because it allows us to expand the way in which we can reach and engage different audiences. And at the end of the day, it's driven by content, and we are content-rich organizations. The Google Art Project actually is a fascinating attempt to see whether or not one can actually replicate in the most sort of immediate way the experience of moving from one gallery to another, and then to do that from one museum to another. At this stage, I'm not sure it's entirely a success. I think it's more an interesting possibility than I think it is a highly successful and satisfying experience.
Now, on the Google Art Project, there's 17 of the great museums of the world. One of them is MoMA in New York. But you really have kind of a low profile on the Google Art Project. You don't have any contemporary art there. You have more of the traditional work that you've been showing since 1929. Isn't that right? Is there a reason for that?
There is a reason why we have such a limited presence on the Google project. It's really because of rights clearances. So much of what we deal with is still governed by copyright. So we can only put on display in this context works of art that are in the public domain. And in our case, that's a fraction of our collection, and it tends to be the most historical works. That said, I think our attitude was, let's try this out, let's see if it works, let's try to understand how satisfying and engaging this is. And one of the things about the Google Art Project that's less evident, but I think is in fact more important, is not so much the ability to navigate in virtual space through a museum, but this little sort of high definition effort they made to select one work of art from each museum and to then digitalize it at such a high level of resolution that when you look at it, you feel as if you were looking at it under a microscope. For me, that's a fascinating tool.
So you can zoom in and zoom out and zoom in and see the detail of the picture, and also read about the history and background of the artists and of the work.
Well, there's a lot to learn. I mean, for instance, when you do zoom in, you can really get down to the level of a single brush stroke and the texture of paint. But even more importantly, and I think this is one of the great advantages of the Google Art Project, is you can kind of compare and contrast different museums at the same moment. And that aspect of a community of museums immediately accessible to a viewer anywhere in the world is fascinating. And I think over time, if Google sticks with the project, it will only become more and more sophisticated and more interesting.
Well, do you anticipate expanding your participation?
Well, at this stage, there are no plans to do that, but obviously we're going to continue to look at it, and we're going to think about whether or not there are applications for our own digital site that we might transfer off of the Google project. And if the Google project has a V2 or a V3, we're certainly wide open to participating in that.
Has there been pushback from contemporary artists about appearing on the Google Art Project? I mean, you have many of these works on your own website, www.moma.org.
Thank you for that recognition. There hasn't been pushback. It's really that with our own website, we work comfortably under the umbrella of fair use, the doctrine that allows us to work with material that's copyrighted. With the Google Art Project, we wanted to be very careful, and we did not want to put ourselves in a position that artists might actually feel uncomfortable. If this continues, clearly the next step is to talk to artists and to artist agencies to see whether or not there's a way to migrate some of that material into this type of format.
Now, in 2004, 7 years ago, you made a major commitment to bricks and mortar. You renovated your museum building and expanded it substantially. Do you feel that somehow or other this is undermined? You have 3 million people, last I saw the figures, who visit the museum physically every year. You have 18 million who hit your website every year. I mean, do you detect a shift from live museum going to virtual museum going?
Well, I think virtual and real space in the context of a museum are intimately linked to each other. You can't really disaggregate them at this point. And if anything, I think they're collapsing so that the delta is getting narrower and narrower rather than further and further apart. But virtual space, from a museum's perspective, can only exist as a result of real space. And I think the growth in our audience online is largely a function of the growth in our audience on site. And the two are not unrelated. Clearly, the online audience has a potential of growing faster and larger than anything we could do on site. But we couldn't do what we're doing online if we didn't have our physical space in New York, where in fact the works of art do exist and where we create the kinds of programs that are so engaging for our public. We can also create other programs online that are similar to but can never be the same as those programs that exist in real space. So from my perspective, there's a kind of healthy symbiotic relationship between our online presence and our presence in real space. And I suspect that over time, we'll stop worrying about whether something is online or in real space and recognize that it's a continuum of experiences that are accessible and available to people at different points in their life.
Well, there is a major difference from the point of view of economic modeling. I can go online and view whatever you've put up there, which I assume is the majority of the collection, without paying an admission fee. I have to pay an admission fee at the museum. Now, does that change the economics of a greater commitment to the virtual museum?
Well, I suspect over time, many so-called virtual and free spaces are going to find ways to monetize what they're doing, because the reality is it costs a tremendous amount of money to maintain a good and strong and robust online site, and there's going to be a point where it's simply not sustainable without some form of revenue. We're still in the very early stages collectively of trying to figure out how that could be done, whether by subscription or by advertising or micropayments or who knows what other strategies might.
Or a paywall.
Or a paywall. And you know, people have tried that before and it hasn't succeeded, essentially because so much is available for free. Why would you pay for anything? But as more and more entities are compelled for financial reasons to establish some form of paywall or revenue structure, it's going to become easier and easier for the rest of us to figure out how to do that. The cost basis can never be and shouldn't be the same as it is visiting the museum, but the reality is, if you think about the vast amount of content that is available for free online, and then the cost of producing that content, whether for a newspaper, a museum, a talk show, whatever it is, you have to ask yourself the question, how is this sustainable over the long run? And I think what will happen is a variety of strategies will develop that will work for some people and not for others. And at the moment, we're delighted to be able to provide so much for free, but at some point, we're going to have to look at how do we sustain that.
Well, you greatly expand your viewing audience, don't you? Because you have perhaps students who can't afford the price of admission, you have people who don't live in the New York area who can access the collection online, you perhaps have shut-ins who benefit greatly from viewing the works of art. So it opens a whole new avenue to you of viewer participation, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly opens up an avenue of viewer participation, but the reality is even on site today, the vast majority, something on the order of 50% of all of our visitors either come for free, they're children under 16, or they come on Friday nights, or they come through school programs, or they come at substantially discounted prices. So the reality is that even on-site, the cost of admission is not actually the single fee, it's a fraction of that fee because of the way we've created opportunities for people to come and visit. The expanded audience is obviously critical. I think part of our growth in attendance, which has gone from about 1.6 million a decade ago to 3 million today, is driven by our presence online. So there is definitely some connection there.
Yes. Now, MoMA first opened its doors in 1929, some 81 years ago, as a museum of modern art. And then I think you were showing artists like Cezanne and perhaps Picasso and Matisse. They were the modern artists. Now, the majority of your collection today consists of contemporary artists. Isn't that fair to say?
Absolutely.
And so are you a museum of modern art, or is that a moving target and an evolving concept? Or are you a museum of contemporary art?
Well, both modern and contemporary are moving targets, and there's something that are hotly debated both within the museum and among colleagues around other museums. The reality from my perspective is that contemporary art for me is like the leading edge of modern art. That which is contemporary of the moment today slowly but eventually becomes historic, no matter what one wants to do. So contemporary art sprung up as a way of distinguishing the art of the 60s and 70s from the art of the 50s and 40s. But the reality today is art that was made in the 1960s is now pressing 50 years old. And is hardly contemporary in the same way that we mean art that's being made at this very moment someplace in the world, or in New York City for that matter. So there's a very slippery space between modern and contemporary. But again, from my perspective, they're part of a continuum of practices that relate quite closely to each other. And there is a gradual process by which the contemporary moment slides into being part of a modern era.
Well, how can you relate, say, the post-impressionists, Cezanne, Matisse, Picasso, to the abstract expressionists? You get into Rothko and the New York School. I mean, is that a continuum? What is the relationship?
Well, I think there is a very strong continuum between our post-impressionist and early cubist collections and the abstract expressionists, because those painters in New York in the 1950s were actually looking at Picasso in the early years of the 20th century. They were looking at late Monet water lily paintings that we had on display at the museum. They were looking at Cezanne, and they measured themselves against the achievements of artists like Cezanne and Matisse and Picasso and Van Gogh and Gauguin for that matter. So they were very much aware of that, and what you have is a dialogue between generations of artists grappling with similar problems and trying to position themselves in the same context of achievement as their predecessors. And we have a fantastic exhibition on, and it's coming into its final weeks at the Museum of Modern Art, on Abstract Expressionist New York, that's all about looking at how these artists like Rothko and Pollock, among many others, saw themselves in relationship to Matisse and Picasso and their forebears. And I think really our ability at the museum to set a context, to make it evident and clear that art doesn't spring from sources unknown. Art springs from this constant effort by artists to think about other art. And we can be the place of discovery for that.
Well, but then you have minimalist painters, Reinhardt or Martin, although Martin, I guess, called herself an abstract expressionist, but the Reinhardt all black, Agnes Martin all white. How do they relate to Matisse, Picasso, Cezanne, the post-impressionists?
Well, I think both in the case of Agnes Martin and Ad Reinhardt, they were seeking to do something that had to do with creating emotive conditions for looking at and thinking about painting. And they come directly out of abstract expressionism because they looked at that emotive dimension of abstract expressionism and tried to distill it, tried to make it into something that was almost ethereal in a way, but also entirely self-referential, that was not about something else. And minimalism, which follows on from that, is in a way a kind of distillation. It says, what can we strip away from the practice of art making so that we get down to the very essence of what a work of art is. It's a kind of investigation of what the limits are or the boundaries are for artistic practice. Relating very specifically to the achievements of artists like Pollock, who didn't leave a lot of room for his peers to work in. When you, the scale he worked at, the energy that he gave to his work, the kind of heroic success of his work, set a challenge for artists. And one of the ways that artists are able to respond to that is to try and do the opposite, to move away from it, to explore that which wasn't part of an artist's practice.
Well, Pollock was the guy who put his canvases on the floor and then, with a flick of the wrist, drip paint on the canvas. I mean, why is that art, and how does that relate to what Picasso did?
Well, I think for Pollock, what he was trying to do was to explore how to make painting that's about painting. When you think about any of his predecessors, but especially artists like Picasso or Cézanne or Léger or Matisse, they're artists who are making something about something else. They're using paint to represent something other than paint. And Picasso never really becomes an abstract artist. He's always conscious of his tie to something observable, even though he's prepared to explore the boundaries of what he can see and understand. Pollock actually said, okay, what happens if I make painting about paint? If I just use paint for what it is and drip and splatter and splash it and brush it in new and innovative ways. And by, in a sense, turning painting into a field of action, which is one of the definitions that came to be associated subsequently with Pollock, that his canvases were fields on which an act occurred. He gives rise to the whole notion of performativity in art. What you actually see is the trace of his movements as he put paint to canvas. And they are utterly extraordinary achievements.
Warhol, soup cans, Campbell's soup cans. I mean, why do you consider that to be art? Contemporary art, modern art, whatever?
Well, I think Warhol enters the scene and looks at artists who practice, broadly speaking, this notion of abstract expressionism and doesn't relate to them, recognizes that they're not speaking to him about the things that matter to him. And in a post-war consumerist and increasingly affluent American society, the quotidian becomes important to Warhol, those things that sort of center his life. So he looks at the most everyday, in a way, almost banal object, a soup can, and says, well, this can be art, that I can think about this and make it part of what I see as an artistic moment, artistic expression, because it's about life. And, you know, I grew up in the late 50s and 60s, and my mother thought of herself as a great cook, and she is, in fact, a great cook.
You weren't a hippie, were you?
Well, we don't have to go to that part of my life. That was later. But, you know, I can remember endless dinners of, you know, Campbell's tomato soup. I still like it. You know, so those things are embedded in many of our consciousness, and what Warhol understood is that by changing the context in which you saw a soup can, you could move it from the everyday to the space of art.
Okay, well, a soup can is an object, and you have recently said that there's been a shift in emphasis at the museum from the aura of the object, I think you call it the aura of the public. Mm-hmm. So the public's invited into the work of art, like the work of Richard Serra. Mm-hmm. And tell us about that. How did that occur, and what does that represent?
Well, I think there's a really interesting shift that's occurring in a lot of contemporary practice, certainly not all, but a great deal, that grows out of actually the kind of performativity that is associated with artists like Pollock, which is to recognize that the public, those who come to look at art, are integral to the art itself. And there are a number of artists who are now inviting the public to participate in their artworks. They, of course, have antecedents in the 60s and 70s of artists who did similar efforts to engage the public in the actual construction and experience of a work of art. And I actually think there's a kind of blurring here between social media, which is all about this kind of ongoing social dialogue, and many artists who are creating social art, if you wish, art that is about people engaging with it. And you can think about this as a really interesting departure. So if you think about Richard Serra's sculpture, it really moves away from a traditional notion of sculpture, which is something that exists around which you circumambulate, to something in which you penetrate. You actually are physically inside the sculpture.
So the sculpture provides corridors through which the public can, as you put it, circumnavigate or circumambulate.
That's right. The sculpture itself has both an exterior and an interior as opposed to only an exterior. And the process of moving in and around the sculpture becomes integral to understanding it as a work of art.
But let's move on. Then you have performance artists like Marina Abramovich. You certainly raised eyebrows recently with her exhibition of performance art, including a work called Imponderabilia, which we can't show on television, which involved a member of the public squeezing between two nudes in the gallery. And then there was her sitter work, where she sits there for 7 hours every day and looks at some member of the public who's free to stay staring at her as long as he or she wants to. Why is this art? How does this relate to Picasso?
Well, Marina is one of the most respected and in many ways legendary performance artists who really emerged out of the late 60s and 70s and who understood that her body, or for that matter, the body of any artist, was integral to the process of art making, and that she could engage herself in these tasks that were about putting herself in various complicated conditions and testing her limits of mental and physical endurance, and eventually doing so in a way that invited a public to participate with her. And her sort of culmination was the work that we showed in our atrium at the museum called The Artist is Present, where the work of art is really just that, the artist sitting alone in a space and available to anyone who wanted to sit with her in silence for as short or as long as they wanted to. And what she was able to create is a kind of charismatic space that was so emotively charged that people actually broke down in tears. They sat transfixed, some for 8 hours at a time. That was mesmerizing. And what was fascinating to me is that over the course of this exhibition, it wasn't just the people who were sitting with Marina who were there transfixed. It became an audience that came to watch other people sitting with Marina, because there was no hope that they were ever going to sit with her, because on a good day we might have been able to accommodate 10 or 12 people. So the reality is there is this hunger on the part of our public to connect with each other and with artists in a meaningful way. And that's what Marina catalyzed, this possibility that we as individuals could connect with someone else in a very powerful and direct way.
A transaction between the public and the artist, which doesn't exist with traditional works.
Absolutely. It was this sense of both the emotional and the transactional was central to her work, and she understands, and she's extraordinarily articulate about this, she understands the degree to which we as individuals in this very complicated, often turbulent world in which we live have a desire to be with other people in a meaningful way. And what she created was the capacity for that to be unleashed.
Now, in the 20s, Paris was certainly well known as the art center of the world. In the 60s, it was New York. And then artists began to move away from New York. I mean, Agnes Martin was here in the 60s, and she moved away. What are the art centers of the world now? Is it one? Has it become globalized? Are there many art centers?
There are many art centers today, and it makes it interesting and difficult at the same time. New York, for sure, remains one of the most important, maybe still the most important, but where it was alone, or virtually alone 50 years ago, as a place that artists needed to be. Today there are major centers of production in Brazil, in Sao Paulo and Rio, in Los Angeles, in Berlin, in Paris. You can go on, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Istanbul. We live today in a much more complicated, in a way much more interesting, globalized world where artists move around a lot, have access to each other's work, are in constant dialogue with each other, and while it may still be important to be present occasionally in New York, or in Paris, or in Berlin, or in London, it isn't essential anymore. And I think that means that for those of us who are trying to understand what's happening on the contemporary front, you have to be in constant motion. You have to go to where the art is being made, and to where it's being seen, and that means literally traveling across every continent.
Well, we've talked about the web, and I think you've made it clear it figures in your long-term strategic plan. It's certainly one of the elements that the Museum of the Future will have to consider. So I have a question for you, Glenn Lowry. And the question is, will the minnow swallow the whale? And will the Museum of the Future become largely digital?
Well, I think there's going to be a rebalancing for sure, because at some point, every museum, no matter what its resources might be, becomes constrained. You can only become so big. You can only ultimately acquire so many works of art. And with that constraint, there's going to be a kind of concomitant desire to continue the kind of programs that are essential to what we do, and the web is going to be an ever greater part of that complex, if you wish, that museums get to work with. And
the web is going to be an ever greater part of that complex. We have to wrap up, so thank you very much, Glenn Lowry, for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. Don't forget to visit our website, www.digitalage.org, to learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.